let's begin the new one panel. And let me introduce our presenters. So there are Benjamin Brown from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Israel, and Elly Moseson. So you see Elly's affiliation in the program Tel Aviv University. Elly just recently told that there is a change and his new affiliation is Boston University, USA. Am I right, Elly? Yeah. So, moving to the first lecture by Benjamin Brown, the Ostroh conflict and your perspective on the circle of the Besht. Benny, welcome.
So good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad to be here with you. Actually, the paper I'm going to present here is a continuation to an article that was published about a year ago in Zion regarding this exactly this conflict, which I'll summarize in a few sentences just in a minute. But a little after, short after the article was published, I had some further thoughts. I would say I took a broader perspective on this conflict and its implications and significances. And those are the ones I would like to share with you. What this conflict actually represents in the history of early Hasidism, in my opinion, at least. Now, since of course I can't summarize all the proofs and justifications for my arguments, I only summarize here the bottom lines for those of you who didn't read the article, or for those of you who read but don't remember it. I'll summarize it in a few sentences, but if you want to read the argument in depth, of course, the sources and the corroborations are in the article itself. So the interesting point in this article is that it actually brings to light a conflict that was absolutely forgotten or gone unnoticed by earlier scholarship. And that is because probably it didn't appear in the sources, classical sources of early Hasidism, but you have to first find at least the first sources in a later text, and that is Mazkeret Legdolei Ostroh by Menachem Mendel Bieber, who is considered to be a very important Orthodox historian, not only because he really documents the internal traditions of Ostroh and other, and also, you know, things that he heard from the elders of Ostroh, things like that, but he also documents some of the he actually brings to the reader some of the documents that were still there in Ostroh during his time. He had access to them, and this way he actually internalized them after, of course, after the wars and the Holocaust. We don't have the originals today. His documentation is considered to be very reliable. And here comes the story. The story, the book is built, most of the book is built according to important personalities in the history of Ostroh. Through them, actually, Bieber disseminates a few ends of threads that we can pull, and thanks to his information, reach further evidence on the conflict that he only insinuates. He doesn't write about in detail because he doesn't like to talk about conflicts and ugly things in the history of his town. So the three main figures about whom he writes are Jospe Ostroh, who is considered to be one of the wealthiest persons in Volhynia of that time. and his business went as far as Germany. The other one is the other one is his son-in-law, which is who happens to be also the brother-in-law of Yaakov Emden. His name is Avu Meshulam Zalman Ashkenazi. He's not exactly his son-in-law. Actually, he married his adopted daughter. He also had a granddaughter. But since his son passed away, he adopted her as his own child and married her to Avum Meshulam Zalman, we call him Meshulam, who didn't come from Volhynia. His family origin was from Germany. He spent his youth in Amsterdam, but then his big brother, Yaakov Emden, married him to Rabbi Yosef's daughter, stepdaughter. The other important figure is of David Halperin. David Halperin was the son of Rabbi Israel Halperin. Both of them were disciples or members of the circle of the Baal Shem Tov, but he was a rabbi by his own right, and he was accepted to be a rabbi in Ostroh in the year 1731. But as Bieber documents, it was only in 1737 that this nomination was recorded, and this already seems to be an evidence that there was some conflict over it. But at that time, actually, he was also dismissed. We don't have officially dismissed, but Bieber himself writes that there was a quarrel over a rabbinate, and eventually the one who took his place was Meshulam. As I said, the son-in-law of the strong person there in Ostroh, and he became officially the rabbi in 1745. As it was conventional in those times, to get the nomination for rabbi was something that cost a lot of money, and his father-in-law, Meshulam's father-in-law, Yospe, had enough money to afford that, and he actually made this nomination possible. Now, because of this victory of Meshulam and the quarrel that burst around it, we know that David Halperin, the dismissed rabbi, had to leave the town, and he left for Zaslav. It was, as we learn in a few minutes, by the advice of the Baal Shem Tov. Now, the picture seems to be, another rabbinate conflict, which there were many rabbinate conflicts in the history of Eastern Europe, and this is another one, but it is a little more interesting than it seems. First of all, I'll skip a few years further forward. Rabbi Meshulam and his father-in-law were not in good terms. Actually, they came to conflict themselves. So Rabbi Yospe wrote a will, and in his will he writes that he doesn't give any inheritance to his son-in-law, and the inheritance that he bequeaths to his grandchildren was done not through their father, but through some alien person, some stranger, who would be the trustee to give them the present for bar mitzvah. And the Meshulam himself wrote in his later writings, and he has a book of responsa where he also gives us a few details about his sufferings. He says that he had to go out of town in his later years when he was already not so healthy, because of the conflicts and because of the debts that chased him. And he says that all of that is because of he says, Asher svavuni ba'alei chitzim atirei devei chami. I was surrounded by people with arrows, and those are, he uses Talmudic phrase here, Atir devei chami, the rich people of my father-in-law's household. So he blamed his father-in-law for being responsible for his persecution. So the issue becomes more conflict. We also know, and here I come to our business, that Rabbi Yosef was not only married his stepdaughter to Meshulam, but he had another son that was married to David Halperin's family, of David Halperin's sister. Sorry. So Rabbi Yosef indeed was involved in a few conflict of interest from different directions. But the most important, or the more important side of this conflict, as far as we're concerned, is the place of the Baal Shem Tov circle and all that. As I said, David Halperin, the one that was fired, the fired rabbi, was a member of the Baal Shem Tov circle. We know that. He too left a will, and that will was published as a book by itself. So it's only a few pages, where he bequeathed a lot of money to other members of the circle of the Baal Shem Tov. We know that he was considered one of the more senior members of the circle. So as I said, let's start maybe with a picture of the great synagogue of Ostroh today. Ostroh is a nice place. Probably, as far as I know, it's one of the places in which the old synagogue was not really preserved, but still we can see it. Okay, just a minute. Here is the Ostroh synagogue. Now it's under construction. This was the town of the Maharsha, one of the great rabbis of the 16th century, and here actually the battle was about. So that's the Ostroh synagogue. The battle in the community was in bottomland between one party, which was the supporters of the fired rabbi, David Halperin, and the supporters of the new rabbi, who was a Meshulam Ashkenazi. The fired rabbi was a member of the Baal Shem Tov circle. The new rabbi was the little brother, the younger brother of Yaakov Emden, one of the great rabbis of that generation on the whole. So the point is that the main figure here, mainly the most powerful figure of Yosef Ostroh, was on the one hand the person who introduced Meshulam, who replaced David, and on the other hand, he was blamed by Meshulam himself, his son-in-law. He was blamed for being hypocritical and actually stabbing him from the back. This is probably what we've seen so far. And the point is, this struggle is interesting for itself. I must say it's not exceptional, but still interesting. But it becomes exceptional because since we start seeing it from the perspective of the Besht circle. According to Bieber, it was the Baal Shem Tov who actually advised David Halperin, his disciple, his fellow man, to leave the town for Zaslav, and actually to give up the rabbinate. And this is what David Halperin did. He moved to Zaslav, but the conflict of the rabbinate was not seized. Actually, a few people who remained in Ostroh kept the struggle on. And one of them was Elly, the Magid Meisharim, the preacher, the preacher of the town. And others were people who kept supporting Reb David, and actually, even if there was not much chance that Reb David would return, they kept fighting the presiding rabbi Reb Meshulam. And still in that period, in the 1740s, short after David left the town, we know that a few other disciples of the Baal Shem Tov came to Ostroh and preached, and we know that because they were welcomed by the Chevra Kadisha, and there is even a notation that they gave them the special presents that they give to guest preachers. And we also know that the Baal Shem Tov himself visited Ostroh at least twice. At least twice, we know that because later on, and this is maybe the most dramatic part of the story, the community of Ostroh actually wanted to ban, to put a cherem on the Baal Shem Tov. The text of this cherem is known to us from many years ago. It was first published in 19th century, already by David of Makov. But many scholars actually doubted the authenticity of this text because they had some questions about this, about a few details in it. Actually, we can say that now since we know about the entire Ostroh conflict, and we can actually settle all the disputed points, and this text should be taken as authentic, even if the Baal Shem Tov was finally not banned, was not under cherem. It is clear that there was such an attempt, and at least this text was done as part of the attempt to ban him. So from this text of cherem, we know that the Baal Shem Tov visited at least twice. He visited the cherem text mentions it two times, but maybe there were even more visits later, and we can't tell. Anyway, and they say that he preached there, and he was really he seemed there like they call him a drunk prophet. He seemed very unnormative, I would say, and they blame him for 5 things. It's the text is very flowery, very pompous, but we can find 5 points in which they by which they blame the Baal Shem Tov in his appearance in Ostroh. One of them is heresy. He spoke heretic words, as they say, in his preachings and the sermons. The other is drunkenness, and they use, by the way, the same term that they later used in the Vilna and Brody bands, Kol Yamehem Kachagim. They do all their days as festivals. He ate and drank during the Yortzeit of one of his forefathers, and at that time still in Ashkenaz they kept the Ta'anit Yortzeit, the Yortzeit fast, and actually the Chassidim were the ones who abolished it practically. It was already the Baal Shem Tov that did it in Ostroh, according to this testimony, and he wore white clothes as the Kabbalists do, and people who are not Kabbalists or not taken as Kabbalists are not supposed to wear, and he mocked the rabbis. They only say it in a very small Talmudic phrase, Mefarer Mare Dechite. Mare Dechite is the Talmidei Chachamim, is the scholars, and the Mefarer them, he was crumbling them, trying to say that actually he belittled them or disrespected them. And 4 of these charges are known to us from later Misnagdic text. The issue of Ta'anit Yortzeit fast is actually it's one of the rare times in which it appears. The later known bands do not mention it. But the point is that the Baal Shem Tov actually appeared in Ostroh at the midst of the conflict, preached, sided with one party, was against the Talmidei Chachamim, probably against the rabbi and his faction, and interfered within an internal conflict of a city. And later on, probably after he understood that he failed to change the condition there, the Baal Shem Tov probably tried to make peace or to appease the conflicting, the other side of the conflicting camp. How do you know that? There is an interesting story in Shivcha Baal Shem Tov, the only Hasidic text of that time to mention both of the figures, the Baal Shem Tov and the Meshulam, according to which it tells the story about the Baal Shem Tov that dreamed about or saw the figure of Meshulam's father, Chacham Tzvi, and he warned him against going in the ways of Ukraine. Ukraine, in that sense of the word, is not Ukraine of today. In that time, Ukraine was only a small region of the area, and the Baal Shem Tov does not give this message to Meshulam by himself, but sends one of his disciples to tell him. And according to this story, Meshulam was really happy to know that, and he treated it very respectfully. And on that occasion, this Talmid of coming here also gave him vote by the Baal Shem Tov on the words of the Bible, Asher Nasi Cheta, and Rashi's commentary on it. And Shifcha Besh doesn't tell us what was the Dvar Torah, what was the Torah, Torah idea that this disciple, that Yosef of Kaminka told him. But if we scan the writings of Yosef of Polna for places in which the Baal Shem Tov is quoted with regard to this pasuk, it's indeed quite a radical message. What the Baal Shem Tov and Yosef bring in that context was Asher Nasi Echta. Rashi says Ashrei Leshon Asher Leshon Ashrei Ashrei Ador שהנשיא שלו נותן לב להביא כפרה על שגגתו, meaning that blessed is the generation which the leader is brings regrets, or the Asher Nasi Echta is regarding the sacrifice that the king brings when he sins. So Rashi says, blessed is the generation which the king is seeking for atonement for his sins. And on this idea, the Baal Shem Tov builds, there are two places in which the Baal Shem Tov speaks about it. He builds a new idea, even more radical, saying that actually pride is more severe than sin, and that leaders are often tending to pride, and therefore it is better, says the Baal Shem Tov, that the leader, the Nasi, yes, the king, makes a sin with a halachic sin rather than sin in pride, and he better sin than remain proud. Another idea that he brings here in this context is also that when he does tshuva, when he repents from his sin, he comes down to the sinners and can bring up the sinners with him in his tshuva, in his repentance, which is actually the doctrine of the descent of the tzaddik that was developed in the Besht circle at that time. But if we take this idea and connect it to other sources that we know, once again, not mentioning Ostroh in particular, but that were already suspected to be referring to a conflict such as the one of Ostroh, we know that indeed the Baal Shem Tov not only came to Ostroh to preach his Hasidic messages, but preached against the gava, against the pride of the leaders, and tried to amend, to bring people to repentance. In other words, he really took an active share in the conflict, and actually was taking sides in the conflict, and actually interfered within the community business. And it is not such a big surprise that the community responded with trying to ban him. This struggle was actually came to the first stage of this struggle came to an end in the 1760s, actually because most of the main figures passed away. Baal Shem Tov passed away in 1760, and the other figures, Yosef Ostroh and the David Halperin and most of the people here, passed away at that period. But in the second stage, Baal Shem remained the rabbi officially. In the second stage, it was the Maggid of Mezrich who became involved in that struggle, still against Meshulam. And the active force within that second stage of the combat was the Maggid's disciple, was the preacher of Ostroh, the young preacher of Ostroh, Rav Yevi, Yaakov Yosef of Ostroh. And he really ran the struggle, and eventually Meshulam had to leave the town and roam from one town to another in the Ukraine area until he passed away in 1777, and only then the Hasidim reached actually gained the victory over his camp, and the new rabbi that was nominated to Ostroh in 1777 was Meir Margaliot, the famous Meir Margaliot of Ostroh, another disciple of the Baal Shem Tov, who wasn't really involved with all the struggles of the Hasidic camp in the 1770s, so he could be a kind of not a compromise. It was a clear Hasidic victory, but still a more relaxing force in the town. And that was actually, I mean, the end of the struggle. Since then, actually, Ostroh was conquered to Hasidism, and later on it only continued and became stronger in the town. The point this is the story in short. This is the summary of the story. But here I think comes the analysis, which I would like to take a few steps further. We always deal with, first of all, it's my picture now, not Ostroh, right? You can see me now. It's okay. Okay. First of all, we often talk about Hasidic politics with regard to the 19th century and on. Yes, and Hasidic real politics started with Machzikei Ados, as they called it, which, if we're in Lviv, that's the place where actually the first convention was held. Yes, and when Hasidim started to organize themselves in political parties. We can start Hasidic politics even before that, you know, with the Shtadlanut that some Hasidic rabbis were involved in. Martin wrote about Isaac of Yitzchak Uvorki and other rabbis as well were involved in Shtadlanut. Actually, Martin had an article with a few figures that were involved in Shtadlanut. All from 19th century, and indeed, the more Hasidism was institutionalized, and the more the role of the rabbi was institutionalized, the more they're involved in politics, community politics, and intercommunity politics, and countrywide politics, and Hasidism becomes a political power. Of course, it epitomizes in 20th century the Agudat Israel, and further epitomizes here in the state of Israel even today. When we look at the descriptions of the circle of Baal Shem Tov, here we almost see no politics in the existing descriptions. We see a circle of mystics involved in spiritual actions, and spiritual activity around spiritual figures. And the Ostroh conflict actually gives us a totally different picture. If we analyze it in political terms, actually, the circle of Baal Shem Tov works here as a political lobby. It's a lobby working for one side in a completely political dispute within a well-known and strong and famous community. And actually, the Baal Shem Tov works here as part of the political institutions. If we know that, first of all, the rabbinate was a part of the issue, but also the head of the kollel, Moshe was first the head of the kollel, and then they tried to have another head of the kollel from their side, the Chassidim, and also the preacher of the town, of Yevi's father, who already started the struggle, was also part of the institutional community. Not only that, we see that the Chevra Kaddish was hosting the Besht Talmidim who came to town. All this is actually working through the existing institutions of the community. So we can speak about a kind of community politics divided in the community institutions, and Baal Shem Tov's work works through those institutions. Now, this is on the one hand. Now, on the other hand, the Baal Shem Tov himself comes without any title. The Baal Shem Tov is not a rabbi. The title of a tzaddik is not yet existent. He's just a Baal Shem, and we've heard, as Elly mentioned, yes, a Baal Shem is a kind of prestigious position, but still it's not an official position, certainly not a community institution. So he comes there as what? As part of, you know, a culture of hosting preachers from time to time. This is how he comes. But on the other hand, he's working through actually the aristocracy. His men there in Ostroh is of David Halperin, a son of the Halperin family, a very strong Eastern European family, and eventually, long after he passes away, the Baal Shem Tov and David Halperin himself too, the one who wins is Meir Margaliot, also a member of the Margaliot family, also a member of the aristocracy. So the Baal Shem Tov actually reflects here a kind of social mobility that reminds us more of what we used to consider as old-fashioned, romantic, hagiographic descriptions of Baal Shem Tov, and all the description of Hasidism as bearing a social message were usually dismissed by later scholarship as kind of apologetics or propaganda. But here we see that actually Baal Shem Tov does represent, first of all, he fights the elite, one elite, but he fights the elite from a basis of power that is centered on other elite or other parts of that elite itself. It's what you can call the aristocracy of rabbinate, money, and yichus and lineage, and all the three, yes, money, rabbinate, money, yichus, work together here as two parties, and the only alien force here within the game is the Baal Shem Tov, who came from below. But the Baal Shem Tov involved, and here we come closer to the modern scholarship's findings, Moshe Osman's findings. The Baal Shem Tov does work from within the aristocracy. I mean, he himself didn't come from there, and he wasn't part of it, but he works with them and as part of them, and actually finds his place quite well without, he doesn't seem to be hesitant or shy or having inferiority complexes or anything like it when he works with the aristocracy. He speaks to them, he preaches to them, he even rebukes them when he finds it necessary. And actually, he can be indeed taken as an example of some kind of social mobility in the 18th century, in which I think it was quite rare. Now, this is one part of the Baal Shem Tov policy and or political involvement. But let's see what is the Baal Shem, how does the Baal Shem works as a politician. Once again, we know how the Baal Shem Tov works as a magician. He uses these shemot and those shemot and these amulets and other blessings and formulae. We know how the Baal Shem Tov works as a theologist. Yes, we know his theological innovations. How does the Baal Shem Tov work as a politician? And now, if we now consider him as kind of political person, a man involved in the grassroots politics, how does he work as a politician? So, if we can, the sources that we have are not very informative. It's quite, I would say, piecemeal. But if we can try to construct the picture, the Baal Shem Tov actually starts with the strategy of appeasement. He tells of David, retire, go away, quit, move down, and David does it. But this appeasement is only, I would say, a kind of temporary appeasement or a preparation for the next stage, because it doesn't really, the Baal Shem Tov didn't really tell him to withdraw, didn't they tell him to give up completely. He kept sending in his disciples to town and try to incite actually the population against the nominated rabbi, and the rabbi that already took the post, or was in the active rabbi. And this kind of preaching, yes, that the community hosted, and his own visits. By the way, we know that Heilman, the author of Beit Rabbi, the Hasidic, the Chabadnik biographer of the Balatanya, he tells that his great-grandfather was a child at that time when Baal Shem Tov came to town, and he was one of the, as a child, one of those who were impressed, who came to welcome the Baal Shem Tov, already then an important figure, and was impressed by his personality as a child. So we know that, in fact, it's not only that the Baal Shem Tov's the Baal Shem Tov's figure was kind of a democratic social mobility case, but his strategy also was, once again, closer to the type we know from earlier scholarship, that the works that were often treated as romantic and hagiographic, as someone who really turns to the people, addresses the people, tries to mobilize the people against the elite. So on the one hand, he's a part of the elite, and we know that this is not the only case in history in which it worked, that the elite, in the elite itself, we can find people who want to build not on the elite itself, but rather on the wider population, lower strata. And he comes and actually tries to mobilize the lower strata against the elite. those preachings were preaching not only before the Talmidei Chachamim, but in front of the people. And as the Cherem text describes it, he actually incited the people against the Talmidei Chachamim. This is why they took him as such a dangerous figure. So once again, the Baal Shem Tov, as a politician, is a politician who addresses the people. So it's more a kind of social force than we started thinking. And on the one hand, he's a part of the elite. On the one hand, he plays in the two fields. On the one hand, he's a part of the elite and works with the elite. On the other hand, he turns to the people. And the last thing that we have to know that actually when he understood that the battle is lost, he really backed down from his involvement and stepped out of the last years of the Shem Tov were probably more quiet in that issue. We don't have much information about that, but it seems that when Avievi started the struggle again, it was a kind of renewal of the struggle after a few years of quiet. So at the end of the road, when the Baal Shem Tov understands that the battle is lost, it doesn't insist on really keeping it running on, and probably the story about his message to Reb Meshulam was a part of the attempt to get closer, become closer, and make peace with that faction as well. And he probably tried and maybe even succeed in making that peace. But here we also have the spiritual part of Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov, first of all, does not work in an aggressive manner. It doesn't incite people to use violence, not at all. But eventually, when he sees that the struggle is useless, he does indeed seek peace. And we see from other examples from I would say from the context and from between the lines, that the Baal Shem Tov really didn't fear the aristocracy. He, as you see, he intermingled with them quite easily. So it's not his peace-seeking attitude was probably not a part of a fear from the aristocracy or not willing to cope with them. He did go face to face when he found it necessary, but his basic tendency was indeed to keep peace and not revoke struggles when they're actually useless. So on the one hand, and probably he also sided with his disciple, not only because of his love for a friend, for a disciple, for a Talmud, but he probably saw him as the real legitimate rabbi of town that was fired unjustly, and for him it was also a kind of fighting for justice. We don't know have any evidence directed to that, but one of the parables that, as I said, was interpreted as relating to the Ostroh conflict without mentioning Ostroh in particular was one that actually tells us that Baal Shem Tov tried to amend their ways, try to rectify them, try to make them repent, make them better. So indeed, it has also some kind of ideological, moral motivation here beyond the fact that it worked as lobby working for one of its members. So if we can sum this point up, I think the Ostroh conflict is not just one war rabbinate conflict, and not even just a rabbinate conflict in which the Hasidim are involved, but something that actually changes our picture of the Baal Shem Tov in circle. Yes, they're a part of the aristocracy, but also, yes, they're a part of the people working against the I would say the all-powerful force of the aristocracy, and even the unjust usurping of rabbinate posts by the aristocracy. But it's worked against the aristocracy with another part of the aristocracy, because it's not actually a full democratic revolution. The more democratic, I would say, part of it is the very fact that the Baal Shem Tov himself turned to the people, came from the people and turned to the people more than anyone before. And in that respect, I think we have to revive, at least partially, the old images of the Baal Shem Tov that modern scholarship tended to dismiss, I think, too quickly. So this is it so far.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Benny. Great presentation. We have questions. The first one comes from Marcin.
I feel bad to be always the first one. Sorry. But so I'll be the first one to thank you, Benny, for this extremely lively and enlightening presentation, and so important in many ways. I would like to try to connect to what we were talking yesterday, and maybe to look at what you call the political involvement of the Besht, or in later in Hasidism, in relation to what I was saying about a suggestion to the essentialized Hasidism. If we don't look on everything the Hasidim do, including politics, as Hasidic, as if we understand that Hasidim have many hats, and in many of those conflicts, even if they appear as a group, their Hasidic identity is not a prime force in informing their political involvement, then obviously there might be other reasons for which they side with. And this I connect closer to the main argument of your presentation, because towards the end you suggested we might revise back the image of early Hasidism, or the circle of the Besht and his disciples. But then my question is, how much your revision would reinvent the circle of the Besht as early as Hasidim? I mean, as a movement, as anything that connects their either political activities or pattern of public behavior to something that develops later into the movement of Hasidism.
Thank you. Actually, these are two comments, and I'll respond both of them. I'll start from the end. A kind of continuation to this should be the attempt to follow the Maggid's leadership also in political terms, and that is something I did in a new article that is supposed to be published once again in Zion right after Sukkot. So you should try to see that. I try to show that after the Baal Shem Tov's passing, indeed it was initially just a circle and not a movement, and therefore after Baal Shem Tov passed away, all that was left was his Talmidim, and they had their own circles, and nobody was really the leader of those circles, because the Baal Shem Tov didn't name any successor. But through an activity that once again should be described in political terms. We see how during the 1760s, especially around 1766, 1767, the Maggid really gains the hegemonic power as the leader of those that set of groups, and actually being the leader of all those that set of groups, he becomes actually the leader of what has become the Hasidic movement. We can actually put the finger on the stage in which the collection of circles becomes a movement at that time, when he really gains the hegemonic leadership of those circles, and that happens more or less 1766, 67. As I said, I'll write about it then. But still, and here I refer to this, even before it became a movement, I believe that Adar Rappaport's description of the circle as something not really well formed, not organized, not identified, I think it was by much exaggerated. This story and other indications that I show in the article tell us that not only that the Baal Shem Tov himself was better known that we thought, that it is also was more kind of a leader already in his time, even though the people that followed him didn't consider themselves as Chassidim, and there was not such a strong attachment as it was later to later tzaddikim. But yes, he was the leader, and even the examples that Ada gives for figures who consider themselves as equals to him, such as Gershon of Kitov and Nachman of Kosov and the Pinchas of Kowitz, were not actually such, because I mean, they not tell us, it's not the full story, because actually Gershon of Kitov moved to Eretz Israel in 1740 something. Reb Nachman of Kosov passed away. We only learned that recently because his grave was discovered. He passed away in 1741, and the Pinchas of Kosov still was quite independent, but after all did see himself as a disciple and as subject to the Baal Shem Tov. So actually all those who could compete his authority moved aside in the 1740s, and all those descriptions that Ada builds on can be relevant to the earlier stage of the Baal Shem Tov's leadership, while later on he was the leader of this circle, certainly more than anybody else. So he was more dominant and more active and more authoritative than the new scholarship is portrayed him. This is at least as I would say. Does this make his circle a movement? No, it was not enough organized. It was not enough large, and people who admired him without any personal commitment. It wasn't like the doctrine of the tzaddik of later generations. So, but if we take this depiction as correct, still, even if it's not a movement, we can see it as something much more consolidated, solidified, well-formed, identified. Even Meshulam's Yaakov Emden's son, who is actually Meshulam's nephew, was the mayor of Constantine. We know the famous letter he wrote to Baal Shem Tov. He treats him as a leader of a Chavraya Kadisha, as a holy companionship. So actually, they did have an identity, and they did have a well-formed, not framework, but a group of people. So they could work as a lobby, and therefore they could work in such a way that later on could even be, I don't know if it's inspire, but inspire indirectly the later tzaddikim actually worked quite similarly in the sense of working from within the communities, but actually building from within the communities a kind of competing authority to the communal authorities of the rabbi and of all the other aristocratic elites, and actually forming a new elite by themselves. It's the elite theory of the Italian scholars, the Italian social scientists is quite tickling here, I'd say. Yes, reading Mosca and Pareto and the Michels in this sense is quite illuminating, but let's leave this for another meeting. Now, what you ask about the so here I ask both. I think both also the question of why should we define their policy as Hasidic? We should define their policy as Hasidic in two senses. One is because ex post facto we see that the Hasidic movement did work in similar ways. But also in the terms of that period itself, it was Hasidic because it worked for Hasidic people and wanted to put Hasidic people in important posts, and they did have their collective identity, so they did care for that. They did it did matter for them, and also because it had Hasidic motivations, turning to the people, trying to amend the public, trying to fix an injustice that was made. The kind of moral, spiritual motivation that was translated into political action. So in all those respects, I would say it's not only politics by Hasidim, but also Hasidic politics.
Martin?
No, I don't want to go into debating this. I only partly agree, and especially in your later part, because I don't think that everything that Hasidim do is Hasidic, and we would need to find proofs at which choosing between two equal candidates, they choose Hasidic against non-Hasidic for the sole reason that he's part of their circle and not because he's just better one. And this is extremely difficult to prove it, especially for such a small group of data that we have. But let's leave it for later. I don't want to go into this now.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. More questions. Elly, please.
So I want to kind of broaden it out and ask maybe if Elly Moseson would take up this question from the manuscript perspective. Do we see a similar positioning of the Besht in early manuscripts as a central figure in a way that would support Professor Brown's argument here?
I would say we don't have enough material from that period. I mean, there's only one manuscript that it seems may have been written during the Besht lifetime, or at least I'm assuming so, because he's not referred to with any, title as somebody who has passed. He's also not referred with any particular rabbinic title, which is, or as a saint or anything, which makes me feel like it was relatively early, before his reputation as a saint. He was just known as a Baal Shem, so he's referred to as a Baal Shem. But we just don't have enough that sort of material.
Thank you. More questions or comments? Let's move to the second presentation. Okay.
Okay.
So, okay. So the second lecturer is Elly Moseson from Boston University, and his the name of his lecture, "The Besht as Baal Shem: Magic in the Life and Legacy of Israel Baal Shem Tov." Please welcome, Elly.
Thank you, Vitaly. Thank you all for participating. I regret that we're not together in person in Lviv, which is a wonderful city, but some other time perhaps. Okay. Oh, let me upload my, connect my PowerPoint. Okay. While today most famous as a great mystic and as the purported founder of the Hasidic movement, during his own lifetime, Israel Baal Shem Tov was primarily known as a folk healer and miracle worker, that is, as a Baal Shem. Baal Shem have a long history in Jewish culture and were especially prominent among the Jewish communities of both Eastern and Western Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries. And in the last panel, we heard Sophia's wonderful presentation on Hillel Baal Shem and his book, Sefer HaCheshek. The term Baal Shem or Baal Shem Tov is usually translated as master of the name or master of the good name, alluding to the sacred names of God which such figures employed in their incantations and amulets. In practice, however, the expertise of the Baal Shem usually extended beyond the use of divine names and included a broad range of medical and magical practices. Indeed, they are comparable in many respects to the magicians and folk healers known from other cultures under various titles such as wizard, soothsayer, cunning man, or wise woman. Israel Baal Shem Tov, the Besht, began his career as a Baal Shem probably sometime in the 1730s, and it remained his vocation and primary source of income until his death in 1760. While the fact that the Besht functioned as a typical Baal Shem is by now widely recognized, the origins of his knowledge, the particular techniques he employed, and the legacy of this aspect of his activities remain largely unexplored. One of the most important sources of information about the Besht's activities as a Baal Shem is the hagiographical collection Shivchei HaBesht. Compiled sometime in the 1790s and first printed in 1814, this book recounts many tales about the Besht's saintliness and magical abilities. Despite the difficulties of determining the historicity of individual tales, the collection remains a rich resource for understanding the Besht, especially in his function of Baal Shem. Indeed, as an extensive source describing the activities of a European folk healer in rare detail, the significance of the work transcends the particular person of the Besht and his Jewish cultural context. The various tales in Shivchei HaBesht depict the Besht as engaging in a vast array of magical practices and techniques for an equally broad range of purposes. These include amulets for protection, healing with medicines or with bloodletting, exorcising people and homes, foretelling the future, identifying thieves and finding lost cattle, communicating with the dead, with angels and demons, and with plants and animals, traveling with impossible speed, becoming invisible, and fighting witches and werewolves. As this far from exhaustive list makes clear, the Besht functioned in all respects as a typical Baal Shem, and indeed a highly active and successful one. However, while Shivchei HaBesht and other similar sources highlight the centrality of these activities in the Besht's life, they do not generally preserve the particular techniques, recipes, or procedures he employed. What exactly, we might wonder, did his medical magical knowledge consist of, and did he bequeath any of it to his colleagues and disciples? Before turning to these questions, I would like to address the additional question of the origins of the Besht's medical magical knowledge. Where might he have learned the particular skills of his chosen profession? The extant sources do not offer any clear answers to this question, but they do suggest a number of possibilities, including both oral and textual traditions. According to Shivchei HaBesht, upon being asked by local doctors where he had obtained his medical knowledge, the Besht replied, "God taught me." While it is difficult to know how much credence to give this answer, we may note that such claims of divine tutelage are not uncommon among practitioners of folk magic. Other accounts in Shifrei Besht mention a manuscript containing magical recipes that the Besht possessed and apparently used. Books of medical magical recipes in both manuscript and print were quite popular in his milieu, and it is reasonable to suppose that he was familiar with such collections and consulted them. Indeed, medical magical knowledge and practices were ubiquitous in the daily life of 18th century Eastern Europe, and so it is likely that he garnered at least some of his knowledge directly from people in his immediate vicinity, both Jews and Gentiles, and both experts and lay people. It is also worth mentioning that according to Shifrei Besht, the Besht's mother, Sarah, was a midwife, and he himself was referred to with the moniker Israel, the midwife's son. As is well known, midwives often functioned as wise women, and we should consider the possibility that the Besht's mother played a role in her son's choice of career, or at least served as a source for his medical magical knowledge. What about the legacy of his special expertise? Did the Besht teach medical magical recipes and formulae as he taught his pietistic and mystical ideas? And if so, do any of them survive? The vast printed corpus of Hasidic literature does in fact preserve a number of such recipes attributed to the Besht. Indeed, one of the most interesting of these is found in the earliest known document relating to the Besht, and one of the very few he composed himself, a letter he sent to Moses, the rabbi of Kuti, sometime before the latter's death in 1738. This letter concerns certain unspecified matters that the Besht had undertaken on Moses' behalf, and concludes with what appears to be a medical prescription. And I quote, "And do not be concerned with something that issues from a tree. Take the wood, sir, and grind it well and fine, and place it in water, and cook it well until it dissolves. In other words, boil it, and add just a little bit of sugar. This does not cause weakness or diarrhea, but only strengthens the mind and gladdens the heart for the worship of the Lord, blessed be he. Drink this each morning on an empty stomach, and do so each and every morning until it is finished." End quote. Unfortunately, the letter does not identify the particular wood he used, which had presumably been sent along with the letter, nor do we know the exact purpose for which this potion was prescribed. Still, this rare document vividly depicts the Besht in his role as a Baal Shem, with the knowledge and authority to recommend medical remedies to a well-respected communal rabbi. Later Hasidic sources preserve various recipes, formulae, taboos, and health recommendations attributed to the Besht, including behaviors to avoid, for example, giving a knife as a gift or eating raw onions, as well as charms and remedies for toothache, nightmare, or difficulty in childbirth. However, a near exhaustive list culled in the early 20th century from the printed corpus of Hasidic literature gives a total of slightly more than a dozen such remedies or recommendations, a relatively small number given the extent of the Besht preoccupation with such matters. How should we understand this apparent paucity? One possible conclusion would be that the Besht did not share many such recipes, or if he did, most were not transmitted to subsequent generations, or at least never recorded. However, if we look beyond the printed corpus and turn to the extant manuscripts from the late 18th and early 19th century, a rather different picture emerges. Not only do these manuscripts preserve many medical magical recipes and formulae in the name of the Besht, but they also underscore the important role played by the manuscript medium itself in the formation and transmission of this type of lore. The manuscripts containing medical magical traditions in the name of the Besht are of two general types. The first consists of manuscripts containing works of Hasidic literature, that is, treatises and collections of discourses and pietistic practices composed by Hasidic leaders and their followers. Given the more individual and intimate nature of manuscripts, authors, copyists, and owners often supplemented the primary content with additional kinds of information, such as dates of birth and death of family members, financial transactions, personal correspondences, and a wide variety of types of practical knowledge, including medical magical recipes. When such works were printed, however, these elements were generally deemed extraneous according to established conventions and simply left out. In other words, the preservation of recipes attributed to the Besht in these cases was largely due to scribal practices tied to the nature of the manuscript medium, rather than by being incorporated into Hasidic works as such. A second type of manuscript containing recipes attributed to the Besht is the vast corpus of Jewish magical handbooks already mentioned. These handbooks comprise a distinct literary tradition concerned with practical recipes of all sorts, but particularly with those of the medical magical variety. While commonly copied from earlier collections, such handbooks were often supplemented with additional texts and local oral traditions as these became available. As a Baal Shem of great renown, it would be only natural for the Besht recipes to be incorporated into this literary tradition, as indeed they were. Just as the Besht's mystical and pietistic teachings were preserved in Hasidic works, and his Kabbalistic kavanot are found in Lurianic prayer books, some of his medical magical recipes duly appear in magical compendia. Before turning to some examples of recipes attributed to the Besht, I would like to make two methodological observations. The first concerns the problem of determining the target of a given attribution. Some of the acronyms with which the Besht was referred to are identical to those used for other Baalei Shem, both his predecessors and contemporaries. More specifically, two of the most famous Baalei Shem, a grandfather and grandson, who were responsible for a particularly influential magical corpus in both manuscript and print, were both named Joel Baal Shem. Indeed, Israel Baal Shem and the two Joel Baal Shems are thus frequently referred to with the orthographically identical acronym Rivash, Rabbi Y Baal Shem, an ambiguity that can easily lead to misidentification. In such cases, we must rely on external clues to determine if it is in fact Israel Baal Shem who is being referred to or one of the others. Even when the name is explicitly given as Israel, we must still consider the possibility that the scribe had found the ambiguous moniker in his source and rendered it incorrectly. Secondly, we must distinguish between the question of attribution and that of origination. The nature of magical lore makes it exceedingly difficult to determine the ultimate origin of a particular ritual or recipe, since even after a comprehensive investigation of the entire corpus of Jewish magical tradition, we would still need to consider the possibility of lost works or oral traditions that were never recorded. Thus, the attribution of certain recipes or rituals to the Besht might reflect his adoption or adaptation of earlier practices rather than his absolute authorship. Nevertheless, even if a given recipe is found to predate him, the attribution itself remains significant, as this indicates it was something he used or recommended. Let us now turn to some of the manuscript examples. Among the pages of a magical compendium written in 1788, we find an entry with a set of instructions for making an amulet on behalf of a woman who has an irregular menstrual cycle, making it difficult for her to become ritually pure. As we can see, the recipe is clearly attributed to Rabbi Israel Besht, Rabbi Yisrael Besht. In another manuscript collection, we find a formula for constructing a protection amulet to be hung at the doorway to one's house that is similarly attributed to the Besht. A further manuscript preserves a recipe for making a plaster to get rid of worms that was, quote, received from someone treated by the Baal Shem of the Holy Community of Medjugorje, unquote. Again, a clear reference to the Besht and possibly recorded in his lifetime. A remarkably elaborate ritual, or rather a series of rituals and procedures for inaugurating a new house, involving amulets, a pair of black fowl, counted needles, buried jugs, and various incantations, is preserved in the name of Rabbi Israel Besht of blessed memory in a large manuscript compendium from the late 18th century. The performance of such magical rituals for new homes with the goal of protecting its future inhabitants from all manner of harm was quite common, and it should not surprise us that the Besht engaged in them as well. Indeed, Shivchei HaBesht preserves a lengthy tale recounting how the Besht was invited for this very purpose to the Lithuanian town of Slutsk by the wife of Samuel Itzkowitz, one of the wealthiest Jews in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. I would like to take the time here to read this extraordinary text in full, as it vividly illustrates some of the kinds of activities involved in such rituals. And I quote, "Take the names written on the margins." So there were, if you noticed in the previous slide, there are a series of letters and sacred names on the top and side margin of the page. Take the names written on the margins and place them at the doorway of the house. That is, the names written on the side, placed on the same side of the doorway, and the names written above, placed above the doorway. That is, at the head, along with some salt and a slice of bread. And do not complete the building in under a year from the day you begin, but you are permitted to live in it during that year. 40 days before you move into the house, specifically take a black rooster and a black hen and place them in the house for 40 days. During these 40 days, you should say, quote, "I hereby transfer this house to these fowl, from the abyss of the earth up to the sky, along with all exits and entrances, and I have no rights to it. Any claimant should approach them directly," end quote. "And they should be watched for 40 days that they are not lost, and if they are lost, you should take others. And if they are lost after 40 days, that is no matter, but you may never slaughter them. Then you should give them something to eat and throw before them a small silver coin and say, 'I hereby lease the house from them for 7 years.' And then take the coin from before them and go together with your wife to the river, and you should stand with your backs to it and throw the coin backwards into the river and say, 'We give this coin to the outsiders,' chitzonim, so that they not have any sovereignty over the house, just like the scapegoat. Then take a pack of needles and count out 9 times 9. Place each 9 separately, and then when you finish counting, mix them all together. The uncounted remainder discard in a place where people do not go. Then take an awl and make holes in the frames of the doors and windows of the house. These holes should be made without forethought, and you should fill the holes with the needles similarly without forethought, but rather randomly, with the heads of the needles in the hole and the points facing out. And you should recite the biblical chapter about the commandment to make a fence around the roof, Deuteronomy 22:8, and say, 'I hereby make an iron fence so that the outsiders, chitzonim, will have no sovereignty over this house. And the remaining needles you can discard wherever you wish.' After this, and before you enter the house, take small jars and place in each one a bit of quicksilver, seal it with wax, and bury it under the threshold of each doorway of the house and under the 4 corners of the house. And while you are burying them, recite 7 times Psalm 90:17, and let the graciousness of the Lord, Vihi Noam, as well as Psalm 127, a song of ascents of Solomon, except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it, also 7 times. And each day for the entire year, you should recite Psalm 90:17, and let the graciousness of the Lord, Vihi Noam, before sunrise, and intend to encircle the house and your household to protect them from all manner of evil eye, and all illness, and all suffering, and all mishap, and all injury, and poverty, and scarcity, and oppression. And when you place the amulets in the doorway, place them at the top third, opposite the mezuzah, and seal it with aspen wood." Various versions of this ritual were known and circulated within later Hasidic communities. For example, in a manuscript containing an only recently published work by Judah Leib of Linitz, the son of Dov Ber of Linitz, the compiler of Shifrei Besht, we find an alternate version of this same protection ritual. This version is recorded in 2 separate parts on different pages in the manuscript, and is presented as having been received, quote, from Rabbi Joseph of Kamenka, who received it from the Besht. The first part describes, with some significant variations, the components of the ritual involving needles and the jars of mercury, while the second describes one of the amulets mentioned in the other text. This version, however, lacks mention of the time constraints on the construction of the house, the pair of black fowl, and the recitation of Vihi Noam at daybreak. Such discrepancies among versions of a given ritual or spell are rather common in magical literature, and they could be due to different formulations given by the Besht at different times or to different people, or they could be the result of corruption that occurred in the process of oral or textual transmission. The same manuscript of Judah Leib of Linitz's work preserves another rather elaborate recipe, this one for someone whose children have been dying in infancy. This ritual, involving the formation and burial of male and female wax figurines, periodic bloodletting, herbal baths, and the strategic deployment of rue, is presented as having been received from the Hasidic preacher Menachem Nachum of Chernobyl, and as, quote, originating, novea, from the Besht of blessed memory. So, as the above examples make clear, magical recipes and rituals attributed to the Besht circulated orally among his contemporaries and disciples and were subsequently transmitted to later generations. Some recipes were even transmitted far beyond the borders of Eastern Europe, such as the following ritual for the redemption of a soul, Yon Nefesh, preserved in a manuscript composed in an Oriental script that the scribe states he received from a certain Abraham Ashkenazi, who received it from his teacher, who in turn received it from his own teacher, the Besht. A sense of the great value attributed to these oral traditions can be gleaned from a fascinating passage in an unpublished Hasidic work written in the final decades of the 18th century by the little-known figure Joseph Judah Leib of Balta. The only surviving copy of this work is heavily damaged and faulty in many places, but enough of it survives for us to follow the gist of the relevant passage. In a discussion of the spiritual roots of the efficacious properties of herbs, with which the work concludes, the author writes, and I quote, "All the world knows of the great holiness of the Besht, who accomplished awesome things with medicines, samim. He was asked by gentle doctors, from whence do you know this? And he replied, I know it from the wisdom of the Holy Torah. And I received from the holy mouth of Rabbi Moses, the preacher of the holy community of Ladizin, and this is a figure who might be identified as the son of the Besht brother-in-law, Geshen of Kuti, who received from the mouth of the Besht of blessed memory, who received from Elijah the Shilonite. And Elijah the Shilonite, the biblical prophet, was known to have been the astral teacher, a spiritual teacher of the Besht in Hasidic literature. So he received from the mouth of the Besht of Blessed Mary, who received from Ahijah the Shilonite various kinds of medicines and particular species that are very efficacious, misugalim, for healing someone stricken with epilepsy, heaven forbid. These medicines are dependent upon the terrifying archons of the divine chariot, and I tried and tested these matters, and I gave them to several people who were stricken, and all of them were helped, and not one was lost, for it has been tried and tested extensively. Since these are of those matters that should not be written down, I decided not to do so, but I transmitted them orally to my son, the pious Fischl of Poland, and this is Fischl of Stryków, one of the most revered Hasidic saints in central Poland. May the Lord protect me and my son and all of Israel from every disease and illness. End quote. As this passage vividly illustrates, rituals and recipes in the name of the Besht were transmitted orally over generations, and we may assume that many, if not most, were never written down. Those that were written down continued to circulate in manuscript form from within Hasidic communities, as can be seen, for example, in this 19th century Chabad manuscript, where we find several recipes recorded together as a group. Only rarely, however, did these traditions make it into print, probably due to a combination of the perceived esoteric nature of this type of the generic conventions of Hasidic publishing. The magical recipes attributed to the Besht appear relatively conventional, both their aims and means, and as we noted above, it is difficult to determine elements of originality. One feature of the Besht's activities as a Baal Shem that might be considered novel is the extraordinary kinetic role he attributed to himself, and the role this played in the public perception of the efficacy of his methods. A striking of this emphasis on personal charisma is found in a tale recorded in Shifrei HaBesht, which has the Besht inscribing his own name as the sacred name of power in some of the amulets he distributes. The centrality of magic we find in the life and career of the Besht did not disappear with his death, but was maintained within the Hasidic movement that developed in his wake. We find medical magical recipes attributed to many of the Besht's colleagues and disciples, such as Moses of Kuti, Judah Leib, the Mechiach of Polnoa, and Pinchas of Koretz. Indeed, many of the figures who became prominent within the Hasidic movement functioned not merely as saints who offered blessings for material success, which is how they are usually portrayed, but as typical Balei Shem. As Dov Ber of Bolachov, writing in the final decades of the 18th century, noted, in his day, quote, the Balei Shemot have changed their name to Hasidim, end quote. Such well-known Hasidic figures as Elimelech of Lizhensk, Israel the Maggid of Koznitz, and Levi Yitzchak of Barditchev all engaged in folk healing practices in a manner hardly distinguishable from the Besht and other Balei Shem. Thus, we find, for example, an elaborate healing ritual involving wax pouring attributed to Elimelech of Lizhensk, while recipes for getting rid of worms appear in the names of the Mochiach of Polnoa, here, and Pinchas of Koretz. The nature and extent of such activities are vividly illustrated by two letters dating from 1809, one by Abraham Joshua Heschel of Apta and the other by the Maggid of Koznitz. Both letters are addressed to Yechiel Michal, a wealthy and learned member of the Jewish community of Yassi, and concerns his desire for a son and his anxiety over building a new house. In the first letter, Abraham Joshua informs Yechiel Michal that he had discussed his concerns with the Maggid of Koznitz, that he should go ahead with the construction of the new house, and that he will personally instruct him on how to perform a protection ritual upon its completion. In his own letter, the Maggid of Koznitz conveys to Yechiel Michal a blessing for his son and mentions an accompanying amulet that would assist him with this. He then instructs him in a protection ritual for his new house, which turns out to be a variant of the same ritual we found attributed to the Besht. Quote, when God willing you do complete the house, keep a rooster and hen in the house perpetually, and if they die, take others, and if one of them dies, take a mate for the other, and place a pot under every threshold, and in each pot place 7 needles and some quicksilver, and also under the bedding of your wife place such a pot, end quote. The Maggid also mentions that he is sending along some amber for him to burn as well. Finally, and reminiscent of the emphasis on personal charisma we noted in the case of the Besht, the Maggid instructs him to inform the fowl used in the ritual that he, the Maggid of Koznitz, commands them to serve as an atonement and a charm. Further versions of this ritual for a new house continued to circulate widely and were known to such Hasidic figures as Meshulam Feivish Heller of Ishbaraj, David Solomon Eibeshutz, and Abraham of Stretton. The amulet used in some of these versions appears to have been the basis for the famous amulets dispensed around the turn of the 20th century by Isaiah of Kerestir, which itself seems to have been inspired by an earlier one composed by Moses of Ehel. Here, for example, we have a recently published version of this amulet to be used as a protection against coronavirus that incorporates the relevant formula. That's the name, the central formula surrounded in red. As we have seen, not only did the Besht communicate medical magical recipes, but such recipes circulated widely, were transmitted over generations, both orally and in manuscript, and were incorporated into the pre-existing Jewish magical tradition. Furthermore, subsequent Hasidic leaders similarly functioned as Balei Shem, employing, recommending, and transmitting medical magical recipes. The recognition of the important place of magic in the activities of the Besht and those of later Hasidic leaders can help us to better situate them within their specific cultural context and to broaden our understanding of the various roles they played within it. To adopt a formulation proposed by David Frankfurter, such figures functioned essentially as ritual experts, combining elements from both religious and folk traditions in new and creative ways. As Frankfurter stresses, the ritual expert is above all a bricoleur, someone with the skills to make use of whatever happens to be available to accomplish the task at hand. The remarkably rich set of ritual expertise that the Besht and many of the subsequent Hasidic leaders possessed gave them the authority, creativity, and versatility to better address the particular needs of their contemporaries. Much more research remains to be done on the Besht activities as a Baal Shem, their broader cultural context, and their direct and indirect impact on the Hasidic movement, as indeed on the place of magic within Jewish culture more generally. I will just conclude by noting that Hasidic saints especially in their role as magicians and miracle workers, were often referred to in the vernacular as gute Yidden, that is, good Jews. An epithet that, to my mind, underscores the need to consider them alongside folk healers, cunning men, and wise women as one particular manifestation of what was essentially a European-wide, if not universal, cultural phenomenon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elly. So questions and comments, colleagues, please, Martin, Sahi. So first, Martin, please. There are no questions and comments in the chat. Oh, Elly, please. Elly Rubin, please.
Hi. I wanted to ask if you could say a little bit more about the Bashenta's mother and what we know about her. You showed the image of the gravestone, which I'd never seen before, which is kind of surprising to me, as you know, that I would have seen such a thing. So if you could say a little bit more where that photo is from, is the grave still extant,
Sure.
and so on, and you know, any other bits and pieces.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, we don't really know that much about her. We know whatever is mentioned, usually in passing in Shifra Besht. It seems that she lived to a pretty old age, till late in his life. So that sort of undermines the traditions that she was, I don't know, 100. His father was supposedly 100 when the Besht was born, but she was clearly just a young woman. But she's buried in Tofsta, which is a town I visited. This photo was taken before the war, and that's where the gravestone was destroyed, and the location was sort of lost, but based on traditions, memory, and I think perhaps a map of the cemetery, they have a plate. They put up a tombstone approximately where they think the grave is. But yeah, we don't know very much about her, but she was a midwife. And again, he was referred to, at least by some people at some point in his life, as the midwife's son, which may mean something, may not, but it is interesting, I think.
Another question I had is the manuscript that you put up from the St. Petersburg library, the Chabad manuscript with segulas from the Baal Shem Tov. It seems like a lot of these segulas are they're more kind of liturgical than ritualistic than a lot of the other ones that you spoke about. So I wonder if you can discern differences in the kinds of magical traditions that are preserved in different streams of the Hasidic movement.
Yeah, that's a good question, and one that's very difficult to answer. I think it's worth trying to do that, but you have to be, you have to be careful in the conclusions you draw, because again, as we've seen, a lot of what we happen to have comes through various channels that why something is preserved over something else often is just chance or generic conventions, like we said, or the medium of preservation. So you have to be careful on what kind of conclusions you draw from available evidence, which is not that much. I mean, I found these manuscripts and others which amount to a substantial number, but not enough. I don't think it's enough to draw those kinds of hard conclusions, but it's definitely worth investigating more. It's possible, but I found traditions in Chabad that are not just liturgical. So not in this particular manuscript, but in other sources. But it could be that there was a tendency, or it could be and again, it has to do with what period you're talking about. Maybe later in the 19th century, things were different than in the early 19th.
Right. I think this manuscript is early 20th century. Is that right?
Either that or late 19th. Yeah, I think. Yeah.
Thank you, Elly. There is one more question. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Jeff. Thank you for having me, Elly. Thanks
Hi,
so
Jeff.
much for sharing. So I was, of course, intrigued by your mention of Rabbi Pinchas, and this is something I've also wondered because, as you know, the manuscripts are full of all kinds of quote-unquote medical advice, right? Which ranges from, do this crazy magical thing to use this segula to eat some garlic, right? And there doesn't seem to be any kind of distinction from the point of view of the scribe between these different remedies. And you mentioned the saying that the Baalei Shem are now called Hasidim, which I had always understood as meaning that the tzaddikim had now taken over, they fulfilled the role of Baalei Shem, so that people no longer went to Baalei Shem. But that didn't necessarily mean that the tzaddikim were doing Baalei Shem's magic, remedies, folk healing, etc., right? But rather that they were fulfilling the same role in a different way.
Right.
And this is a line that I'm trying to figure out, how do we draw or how do we articulate, right, between someone who is a Baal Shem and someone who is a tzaddik and maybe uses some folk remedies. And I'm wondering if you could give us any insight into, is there even such a line, right? Or is this sort of an artificial construct that we are imposing from, a century after the fact? And if there is something like a line between the two, where might we begin to draw it?
Yeah, that's another good and difficult question to answer. The tzaddikim certainly over time developed clearly new and distinct social functions. They the Hasidic tzaddik and the Hasidic court did not exist prior. Baalei Shem did not have courts in that sense. They sometimes they were mystics and had students, but that was not what they were generally identified with. But especially in the period when Dov Ber's writing, in the early years when the movement is still sort of developing, that's how I understand his statement, that they're fulfilling the function at whatever that function was. Maybe not only that function, they may have other functions as well that they're combining with the functions of a Baal Shem. But I especially given these sources, I think we need to understand that statement as they're just Baalei Shem under a new name, or at least playing the role of Baalei Shem under a new name, maybe combined with other roles as well. Again, the Baal Shem itself is a very tricky and ambiguous category. I mean, who was designated a Baal Shem and who wasn't? There are no hard rules for that. You didn't get a certificate that says you're a Baal Shem. It was a reputation, and I think that's part of the meaning of the term Baal Shem, is a man of reputation. But in any case, what the role of a Baal Shem, precise role of a Baal Shem, varied based on the personality of the particular person, his particular community he was connected to, or his expertise. So it's hard to make very clear statements on that. But from these sources at least, and then when you go back and you read certainly the hagiographical stories, the descriptions of the activities of the early Hasidic figures, you see that this was a big part of what they did and why they were revered and looked up to and consulted and followed.
Thank you very much, Elly, for your very interesting presentation. And there are no more questions. Okay, thank you so much for for attending this impressive panel. Thank you, Benny. Thank you, Elly. Thank you, all those who raised questions.